everybody. Welcome to a Screenwriter's Take. My name is Tony D, and my little dog Joan has decided to join us today as we talk about the movie Venom from a screenwriter's perspective. Why am I talking about the movie Venom? Well, I think it's an interesting movie to break down in terms of screenwriting, mainly because of the third act and the changes that I think the studio instituted that basically ruined what was going to be a really, I think it turned a good movie into a really problematic movie. And I mean problematic from a screenwriting perspective, not a PC perspective. Say hi, Joan, okay? Say hi, my special guest, Joan. All right, so I'm also a comic book guy too, so I understand the background for the movie Venom and the character from the comic book. There are lots of problems with the character. It has a very convoluted origin. You have to sort of be steeped in Marvel Comics to understand it. I think the movie makers did a good job at simplifying a lot of things. So let me break the movie down for you. The first act is great. Really good, really solid, because most of it relies on Eddie Brock, who eventually becomes Venom, and how he's played by Tom Hardy. Great actor, by the way. So it shows Eddie, he's too much of an investigative reporter for his own good. Like, you know, even when his boss and his girlfriend, or his fiance, tell him, "Listen, you gotta back off on this story, or you're gonna get you're gonna get stomped on." He refuses to do that, and he gets stomped on. The rich industrialist he's investigating ruins his life, ruins his career. His fiance leaves him, and then it cuts to a year later. The rich industrialist, who's like, he's like a sort of an Indian version of like the guy from Virgin, that guy, and he's pretty good in the first act. He comes off as this great guy who's doing all this science work with kids, but really he is obsessed with figuring out these symbiotes, right? And he gets the symbiotes by sending a manned space probe up. They take a bunch of samples from this meteor, and they're living symbiotes. They don't know they're symbiotes yet, but they're living organisms. They bring them back down to Earth to study them. But the ship on the way back crashes, and the implication is that one of the symbiotes got loose, inhabited one of the astronauts, and basically made him crash. So the EMTs arrive on the crash site. They find one of the astronauts barely clinging to life, but he's got one of the symbiotes in him. It jumps into an EMT, who then takes off, and then the symbiote makes its way across the United States trying to get back to the other symbiotes, which in a weird way kind of doesn't make sense. It does and it doesn't. I mean, they eventually take the symbiotes and bring them to San Francisco, but the symbiote that escapes, I don't think it knows that initially, but escapes, and then eventually has to make its way to San Francisco. But a lot of time passes, so one could say that, well, the symbiote wanted to get away from all this noise and rigmarole, but then later realized, oh, I gotta go find the other symbiotes. So that's pretty forgivable, and it turns into kind of a horror movie in the beginning. It's a little bit like, if you've ever seen the movie The Hidden. If you haven't seen The Hidden, that's a really good film. Kyle MacLachlan stars, and the premise is there are these this one alien, and he jumps from body to body, and he's just a maniac. He's like a murdering psycho. And then there's a second alien pursuing him, played by Kyle MacLachlan, and he's sort of like the space police trying to capture this alien or kill him. So go see that movie if you haven't. Now, Venom, this first act is great. Part of the reason it's great is because Eddie Brock ruins his career and his life, and it's all about Eddie, and it has nothing to do with the symbiotes. They're a minor factor in the first act. The second act's pretty decent too. What of course happens is Eddie at first, with his life destroyed, doesn't want to investigate the industrialists anymore. But one of the scientists who's having qualms about the industrialists experimenting with the symbiotes on human subjects. He basically kidnaps homeless people and tries to get the symbiotes to attach, but it never works. It's implied during the film, although not explicitly stated, that the reason the symbiotes can't bond with their human hosts are two reasons. One, it's sort of like a match, almost like a blood type match. You have to have the right body chemistry or whatever to match. But then there's a second factor that's heavily implied, but they back off of, which I think when I tell you about the third act and what I heard the studio did, you'll understand why they backed off on it. The implication is that the symbiotes, once they have a host, have to eat live creatures in order to survive. And it's implied in this scene where Eddie breaks into the industrial place after he contacts this scientist because she tells him all this stuff, and he eventually gets the gumption up to, become an investigative reporter again. He breaks in, finds one of his homeless buddies. Not that he's homeless, but he used to give money to this homeless woman every day. He finds her in there. They had experimented on her. He frees her. And in a great scene, the symbiote jumps in to hit. She dies. And that's a great scene because it just happens really fast. It's not like, one of these superhero origin things where it's like a whole big deal. Oh my God, I'm getting superpowers kind of thing. It just sort of happens, and he doesn't even realize it half the time. And then he gets away with the symbiote sort of half realizing he has it and sort of does not really understanding what's going on. When he gets back to his apartment or whatever, he's trying to, the symbiote's making him eat everything, and none of it's helping him. But then later he goes to this restaurant to try to talk to his ex-fiancée and kind of goes berserk eating a bunch of stuff, but then jumps into the lobster tank and eats the live lobsters and then is suddenly satisfied. So that's the only scene that really sort of does that. Shows that Eddie's, oh, now I'm fine now that I've eaten this live lobster. So, but they kind of back off on that. And then the second act has this really cool car chase where Eddie is on a motorcycle and the symbiote is like shooting out of his body, like moving cars and moving the motorcycle, and it's really cool. So those first two acts are a lot of fun. But where it all starts to fall apart is the third act. Now, from a screenwriter's perspective, what should the third act be? Well, it should be a heightening of what you've introduced in the first and second act. And then what the first and second act introduce is basically a horror-ish movie. I shouldn't say it's a total horror movie. It's not meant to be all that dark, but it is dark. It does have a dark thing. I mean, Venom bites a guy's head off in one scene, which sort of is, it's mentioned, but it's kind of glossed over. I mean, that's pretty bad if you're forced to bite a guy's head off, even if you have superpowers. I mean, that's pretty fucked up. So, there's a lot to be unpacked there, character-wise, if somebody bites off a live guy's head, even if he's trying to be killed by the guy. So, but they kind of move on from that, and it's all pushed towards this ending. So eventually the symbiote who escaped in the initial crash makes it back to San Francisco, and of course, he inhabits the body of the rich industrialist. Now, the rich industrialist, through the first two acts of the movie, has been totally smart, played to the height of his intelligence throughout the movie. In the third act, once he's taken over by the symbiote, he's kind of not that smart anymore. He's just sort of angry and sort of making these big, broad movements. And then the climax of the scene is he's going to launch a rocket and get on the rocket and go get the millions of other symbiotes that are on the meteor and bring it back to Earth. So that's the danger. Eddie, of course, wants to stop it. And by the second act, Venom is talking to him pretty regularly. And it's very problematic from this perspective. The character, Venom, looks like a black Spider-Man. Like he's got a black suit and then a white spider on his chest. The only reason that happened in the comics was was tied into the origin story because the Venom suit actually belonged to Spider-Man first. And the machine, he touched this machine that read his mind, and he was thinking about this other superhero who had a black and white spidery costume, and that's why he ends up with this costume. But then later it tries to take him over and he has to get rid of it, and then the costume survives and ends up bonding with Eddie Brock, who hates Peter Parker and Spider-Man. So that doesn't happen in this movie. There's no mention of Spider-Man that I recall. So there's really no reason for the Venom suit to look like that, other than the fact it's trademarked and you wouldn't recognize it if it didn't have that white spider on its chest. So that's a problem. I mean, from a screenwriter's perspective, there should have been some mention of Spider-Man or spiders in some way to explain why he has this white spider on him. And the character's name is Venom. Why is his name Venom? That's not like an outer space alien name. That's a name for a poison on Earth. And the reason he was called Venom in the comics was because that's a spidery type name, and that's a enemy of Spider-Man. It's Spider-Man versus Venom. So again, they didn't bother to explain that. And the biggest problem is when Venom talks about the other symbiote that Eddie's going to fight in the climax, his name is Riot. Now, you have to understand that these characters were all created in the 90s at a time when, you know, they were just creating these characters and coming up with cool names for them. It sort of works in the comic because Venom was the first character, and it was, you know, a whole Spider-Man tie-in, and then the other characters, I believe they spawned on Earth. Either they spawned from Venom or from a meteor. I don't remember. I never read those issues, so forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. But if the characters are developed on Earth and they have names like Riot and Venom, that makes somewhat sense. You could explain that. But if they're coming from an alien rock, they shouldn't have names that we recognize. They should have weird alien names. Now, of course, they couldn't change that in the movie. I mean, one of the solutions might have been to call the characters something like, you know, Venom and then a bunch of other syllables after, and then they call him Venom for short. Or that they called him some alien name, and what does that mean? Oh, it means Venom. It means poison or venom. Okay, I'll call you Venom. Like something like that. Something to explain these rather obvious comic booky names. But they don't do that. You know, unless I tuned out in the middle of the movie, I don't think there's any mention of Spider-Man. Maybe there's like a newspaper headline, but it really should have, they should have tied that in somehow. And so the third act kind of changes in tone. Well, I shouldn't say kind of, it really does change in tone, and it becomes basically a superhero movie. The motivations for Eddie in the beginning are kind of, you know, it's partly for revenge for his friend, partly because he just hates this industrialist guy and the guy ruined his life. But by the end, it becomes sort of this heroic thing. And Venom has no heroic qualities, at least from the comics. Suddenly in the movie, towards the end of the second act, Venom's just like, okay, I'm on board with doing this. Makes no sense. He's on board with fighting Riot and his brothers, or his cousins, even though he admits he's the weakest version of the symbiotes. You know, he says to Eddie in the movie, Eddie, I'm a loser like you. That's why I want to stay on Earth and not see everyone die. Like, it's a pretty weak justification for Venom turning it all around. And there's not a lot of development, and this is part of the problem. There's not a lot of development with Venom as a character. He's just sort of there initially to make Eddie's life miserable and create a bunch of funny scenes where Tom Hardy has to eat garbage and go, well, who are you? What's happening to me? So the end of the movie, the climactic battle between Riot and Venom, is just this CGI nightmare where, you know, Tom Hardy and the other guy, I forget the actor's name, are duking it out, and the suits are transforming. They're coming on and off them, and you know, it sort of devolves into a standard superhero movie, good versus evil. And it feels very rushed, I'll add too. So I think there was something else there, because the buzz on the internet was the studio didn't like the dark original ending and they wanted it to be light so they could franchise this movie and tie it into Spider-Man. I think that was a mistake, big time. I think it would have been much more interesting to have a truly dark hero, or whatever you want to call him. So when he met up with Spider-Man, it would have made total sense. It would have made, you know, it would have been like, well, Eddie's the bad guy. Instead, we get this weird ending where Eddie's kind of a good guy again. And I don't know if that works for Eddie Brock. You know, maybe I'm prejudiced because I did read Eddie in the comics, but Eddie was kind of the antithesis of Spider-Man. In this movie, he's very competent and not angry at Peter Parker at all, because I don't even think he knows him in the movies yet. But again, that's a comic book. From a strictly a screenwriting perspective, in that particular movie, it doesn't fit the tone of the movie. The beginning of the movie is Eddie wrecks his life because he goes too far. The end of the movie has to be, in my view, one of two things. Either Eddie realizes his mistakes in life and doesn't go too far and saves the day because he stops himself, or the opposite. Eddie's never going to change. He goes too far again and maybe kills his fiancée in the process of trying to, like, you know, kill this industrialist, and, you know, it's a dark ending. But I mean, I guess you could see why they wouldn't want a comic book movie to end dark. But when you bite off a guy's head in the middle of the movie, and that's one of the cool scenes, I mean, you've already gone pretty dark, in my view. But then again, that's Hollywood, right? Like, you can bite off a guy's head, oh, no problem. Your fiancé dying? Oh, no, we can't have that. We can kill a bunch of nobodies with no names that are in the dark that you don't really see or know, but kill a real character that we've gotten to know? No, we don't want people to be sad. We just want people to react like a video game. So that's the problems I had with the Venom movie. I think it would have been a much better if they had just played it straight up horror movie as advertised. It was going to be a superhero horror movie, and really, you know, at the end, Venom could be that character. Like, yeah, he wins at the end, but he's still a messed up monster inside that Eddie can barely control or not control at all. And it's going to destroy him, and it's going to destroy the people around him. And that would be cool. It would be dark, but it would be cool. Instead, they've got this sort of happy ending, which feels very tacked on. In my view, the last 20 minutes of the movie felt like, wow, they just went in and chopped it all up and put that into the movies just so they could have a franchise. Oh, and the after credits sequence, my God. So they introduce Woody Harrelson's character, who's going to be in the sequel, and he's an even worse version of Venom because he's going to get a symbiote. He hasn't gotten it yet. But they introduce him like he's the Joker. And in my view, he's not even that popular a character. He's the guy who's going to be Carnage. And in my view, he's just not that popular a character. He's certainly not the Joker. He's going to be the bad guy, and I could see him introduced. But the way they introduce him, it's like you already know him. I sort of know him. I never read the Carnage comics. They were just too much for me. I was just like, these are stupid. But, you know, they introduce him like, here he comes. And I don't think that character holds that kind of weight. I think they needed more than just a Silence of the Lambs scene tacked on. Tom Hardy, though, he's such a good actor, and Woody Harrelson, too. He's a great actor, too. You know, they bring weight to the roles no matter what. I mean, they're A-list actors, so, you know, in some respects, the scenes kind of work just because it's them and they're so famous and good actors. But, you know, I don't really know. I'll probably see a Venom sequel, only because I think the filmmakers were very skilled, and I would include the screenwriters in that. I think, you know, if what I've read online is true about the studio sort of forcing this redone ending, I think they would have been better served had the studio said ahead of time, listen, we want a happy ending, you got to make that work. Because they could have made that work. I saw the skill in that movie. The skill is there. It could have worked. They just would have had to tweak a few more scenes instead of like trying to cram all this stuff in it that, you know, instead of going down the horror movie route, they should have went down a more lighter version of it. Yeah, Eddie's got some problems and he's kind of a dark guy, but, you know, you don't have Venom bite off people's heads. You have Eddie stop him at every turn. Make Eddie a lighter character. Because that's the ending of the movie, and it feels weird. It feels weird when Eddie does that at the end. It's like, this isn't the movie I was watching. So, should you go see the Venom movie? It's not bad. I mean, it's certainly worth, a Netflix rental. You know, if you're into superheroes and you like Spider-Man and stuff. And inevitably, hopefully they'll do the Venom versus Spider-Man movie. I don't think the second one's going to have Spider-Man in it. They might tease him in it, but hopefully by the third movie we'll get the big fight between Venom and Spider-Man. That I would definitely tune in to see. All right, well that's it for the Screenwriter's Take today. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you to Joan for sitting in. I'll see you next time.